Hi, everybody, and welcome. First off, welcome back to Communication 205 Research Methods. That's the same old course you started back at the beginning of February. On the other hand, welcome for the first time to our all new, improved online edition of Communication Research Methods, brought to you by the COVID-19 virus. What we're going to do for the rest of the term is do everything online, sometimes with Zoom, other times like today with a PowerPoint slide with recorded audio. We'll start out right now by going on to talk about quantitative surveys. So we probably all think we know what it means when we say we're going to do a survey. We know what a survey is, but I think it's always good to go back to roots and work out what meanings a word actually carries. So survey, the verb, is from the Old French surveiller, and that itself is from the Latin supervidere, which meant literally to look upon or look over. We have different meanings derived from that in the English language. We can have the old saying, which pretty much follows the Latin, of master of all he surveyed, in quotes, meaning someone's looking out at a view and everything they see belongs to them. We can have the more geographical meaning, surveyors who determine boundaries ranging from property boundaries all the way up to national boundaries, and generally work with cartographers to do things like making maps. But in the social sciences, we mean a specific way of gathering data by asking questions and getting people to report on their own or others' demographics, opinions, attitudes, beliefs, knowledge, affective or emotional reactions, behavior, traits or states, communication networks, and so forth. There's some things maybe surveys aren't so good for. We'll talk about that when we get to the end of this presentation, when we talk about strengths and weaknesses, but there are things that surveys are very good at collecting data on. In the rest of this presentation then, I'm going to talk about surveys, especially using as an organizing framework the stages of survey study. We'll go through these individually, but the stages are setting goals, budgeting money and time, making sampling decisions, determining administration mode, drafting questionnaires, pilot testing and revising questionnaires, administering the survey to collect the data, and then coding, analyzing, and reporting the data. Again, we'll talk about each of these in more detail at a slower pace. So the list on the previous slide is more or less in chronological order, but there are areas where the order is not always quite so clear. It's true that the first thing you have to do is set your goals. Without setting goals, you're not going to do anything. That more or less corresponds to what our textbook calls the theoretical step as the first step. What are goals for a survey? You might want to describe something. You might want to predict something like voting behavior. You might want to look at differences in groups, differences between groups, tastes in video game between different demographic categories, for example. You might want to look at correlations and relationships. You may even want to look at causality. Causality is a special case with surveys. It's kind of hard to determine causality. A causes B, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Something you don't have to worry about in a research methods class is budgeting money and time, but people who do surveys for a living always feel like they could do a better survey if they just had a little more money or they just had a little more time. But we're going to talk next about sampling decisions and determining administration mode. And as I said, some things in the list kind of relate to each other. Theoretically, you make your sampling decisions first, but really your sampling decisions and your administration modes kind of go together. You've got to make the decisions about them both at the same time or kind of going back and forth between them. But to be very specific, you do not always have to sample to do a survey. Survey specifically refers to having the questionnaire, getting people's responses, and determining what those responses mean for a group. But for most surveys that you look at, most published surveys you'll read about, In fact, they did a sample of whatever population they wanted to do. Taking the US population as an example, the US Census does do a survey. It gives you 9 questions. I've given you an example of it on the slide that you can look at, and it's intended to reach the entire population. And the estimated cost of reaching the entire population is 15.6 billion. And granted, that's the estimate from last year before they'd started it. Bet you it's going to cost more than that. So normally, if there's any decent size to the population, surveyors are going to want to take a sample of it because it's impractical, highly expensive, sometimes impossible to reach an entire population. You've got to decide up front how you're going to administer your survey. There are 2 broad categories of administering: self-administered, which means you turn over your instrument or your survey to the respondents and they fill it out themselves, or interviewing. Examples of self-administered include surveys sent by the mail system, postal surveys, surveys on the internet. I'll bet you've all done those. SurveyMonkey is probably the best known example, and more recently surveys that are completed on social media. Interviewing has been probably the most standard mode of collecting survey data. There are two categories under the broad category of interviewing. There's the so-called standardized survey, which means face-to-face. An interviewer sits down with somebody and asks them the questions. And then there's the telephone survey, which until very recently was the standard in surveys. We'll talk about some of the problems that have developed in recent years with telephone surveys in just a couple of slides. On this chart, you can see that different modes of administration have different benefits and weaknesses. Probably the highest cost is face-to-face interviews, but it's also got the highest response rates. By that we mean how many people that you ask actually agree to do the survey. Internet surveys and postal surveys both have much lower costs, but they also tend to have much lower response rates. Other limitations for different types: can you actually get a probability sample? It's possible, but it increases your expense if you're doing face-to-face interviews. It's possible with telephone surveys. It's highly unlikely with social media surveys. Possible with SurveyMonkey and things like that, although difficult, and possible, but with some problems with postal surveys as well. Likewise, the kinds of questions you can ask are dictated by the administration mode that you decide upon. If you're expecting to have probing follow-up questions or open-ended questions, then face-to-face or telephone interview are best for that. You can get away with them on social media and SurveyMonkey and the like, but people are less likely to give you full, complete answers. Also, social desirability bias is something that's really high for face-to-face or telephone interviews and lower for the others, but we'll return to that toward the end of the slide presentation. I mentioned previously that telephone surveys used to be kind of the gold standard for surveys. Political surveys predicting who was going to win a race, what group was going to vote for whom, and so forth, were always based on telephone surveys. But in recent years, that's become kind of problematic. It's introduced some new kinks. And that's because of the differences between cell and landlines in terms of regulation. The 1991 Telephone Consumer Protection Act specifies that it's illegal to use auto dialing for cell phones, but it doesn't do anything to change the existing law for landline phones, which meant that auto dialing was still okay for landlines. What does this mean? It means it's a lot harder for telephone surveyors to complete surveys of people on cell phones because they have to manually dial each phone number in. It wastes a lot of time. Auto dialers have a computer dialing, and every time someone answers, it'll shunt the phone line over to a live interviewer to ask the questions. Also, as a lot of you know who have cell phones are really terrible at giving geographical information. Most people get a cell phone with a specific area code specific to the place where they bought the cell phone, but then as they move around, they keep that area code. So looking at cell phone area codes, you really have no idea where someone might live. They might have the same area code as Roanoke area 540, and they might live in California or Alaska or even overseas. When you want to have a true probability sample, but you want diversity in it geographically, cell phones are a lot harder to work out how to do that with. Also, landline phones, there are extensive lists of pre-screened lines. They've been pre-screened for things like residential versus business, the age of the people that have the phone, and so forth. With cell phones, you get problems because kids get phones. They're not eligible for most surveys without their parents' permission. Businesses might have a cell phone number that's indistinguishable from a residential number until you actually call them, and so forth. So you get a lot more phone calls with cell phones where people turn out to be ineligible, and you only find that out after you've invested 5 minutes in talking to them. All of this greatly increases the costs for getting cell phone surveys, which introduces an interesting sample bias. If you're trying to do a probability sample, you're more likely to get more information from people with landlines, but people with landlines are now a distinct minority. Something like 60% of 60% of phone users either only own cell phones or have a cell phone and a landline but never use the landline. So if you're getting a heavier count of landlines in your survey, that means you're probably getting a lot more older people who haven't made the leap to cell phones yet. Cell phones not only have younger population involved in it, but also are more likely to have a more diverse population involved in it. So if you're relying too much on landline phone data, understandable, it's cheaper, it's easier to do, but it also introduces huge sample biases and kind of messes up what you're trying to find out. So far I've talked about setting goals, budgeting your money and time, making sampling decisions, and determining how you're going to administer the survey, the administration mode. Next, we'll talk about drafting your questionnaire, about pilot testing and revising it, about actually administering it. We'll touch on a special case which tries to capture data about changes over time, which is really relevant to every stage we've talked about so far, but I had to put it somewhere, so it's going in toward the end. Finally, we'll talk about coding, analyzing, and reporting your data, and last but not least, about the strengths and weaknesses of survey methods. Creating your questionnaire has three aspects: writing the actual questions, organizing the questions on the questionnaire, and writing instructions for the questionnaire, for completing the questionnaire. I'll talk about those in that order. There are two basic types of questions you can ask your respondents: closed-ended or open-ended. As we'll talk about in a minute, most of your questions should be closed-ended. Regardless of the type of question you're going to ask, though, you want to keep the questions as simple and as clear as can be. Why? Because you do not want your researcher confused by what you're asking. You want them to understand it in the same way that you mean it. It shouldn't be ambiguous. The wording should be clear and simple. You should avoid jargon and slang unless you're confident your respondents would understand the jargon or slang. Keep it simple, people. So again, you want most of your questions to be closed-ended because they're easier for respondents to answer, they're quicker for respondents to answer, and they're much, much easier for the researcher to analyze when it comes time to crunch data. What is a closed-ended question, though? That's a question where the researcher provides the question and the entire range of possible responses. So that means respondents just click off or check off the answer that's appropriate for them. When you're developing your categories for closed-ended questions, you want to make sure that they're mutually exclusive and exhaustive. You remember what that means from when we talked about content analytic categories. You don't want a respondent looking at your possible responses to a question going, well, it could be A or B, I don't know. Or actually going, well, they've got A, B, C, but that doesn't None of those are my answers. In the first case, they're not mutually exclusive because the respondent is confused about which one is the right answer. In the second case, they're not exhaustive because there's another possibility the respondent has thought of that the researcher has not accounted for. There are some types of questions that you just want to avoid, or types of phrasing of questions you want to avoid, and some are so common that they've been named. One of these is the so-called double-barreled question. A double-barreled question is a question that appears on the face of it to just be one, but when you look at it carefully is really two questions. This is confusing to respondents because if there are two questions but there's only one opportunity for a response, how do they respond? What if they want to answer yes to one and no to the other, but all they can do is agree or disagree with the two combined? The example I give you is the salesperson was courteous and professional, and it's really easy to imagine a salesperson who's very courteous, constantly apologizing, saying yes sir, yes ma'am, whatever, but totally unprofessional because they have no idea how to do their job. Probably not their fault, probably not well trained, whatever. But the point is, they're courteous, but they're not professional. You also want to avoid negative wording generally, and especially avoid double negatives. Negative wording generally can be confusing to respondents. For example, saying, should people not be allowed to use animated billboards along busy streets, is going to make people think, what quite does that mean? It also kind of introduces a little bit of bias because it seems to suggest that the answer is yes, people should not be allowed to use animated billboards along busy streets. Much simpler to just say, should people be allowed to use animated billboards along busy streets, and let respondents answer yes or no. Worse even than that, of course, is double negatives. We all know grammatically that a double negative becomes a positive, as when we say, I did not say it. Haha. Double negative examples in survey questions might be something like, do you not support Congress not passing the relief bill? I don't even know what that means. As a respondent, I'd be kind of confused. Generally, you also, of course, want to avoid biased wording. We've already seen some examples of things that amount to bias in terms of the double negatives and the negatives. But biased wording can be more subtle than that. Even just the kinds of words that are used in the statement. Should the government force you to pay higher taxes? That force is biased, basically. Research has shown that people can be given the exact same question, except a program might be phrased as a welfare program versus a safety net program, and they're much more likely to disapprove of a welfare program than they are of a safety net program. Biased wording leads people to particular responses, in other words, and you want to avoid it at all costs. Close-ended questions are basically indices or scales. The simplest are just dichotomous scales requiring an answer of yes or no, true or false, etc. There are only two possible choices. These are basically nominal or categorical data. It's either the thing is or the thing is not. However, more complex scales allow responses to be treated as continuous interval level data. There are a variety of these more complex scales. The most common one on surveys is probably the Likert type scale, where it gives a statement and asks for a range of answers from strongly disagree through strongly agree. Normally they have 5 responses, although I've seen them with 4 and I've seen them with 7, but standardly the Likert type scale has 5 responses. A little bit different is the semantic differential scale. That's sometimes called a bipolar scale because it has 2 extremes that can be understood as direct opposites, and asks respondents to indicate somewhere along that scale where their assessment of whatever is being asked about lies. Another option is unipolar scales. Instead of 2 opposites that the respondent rates going in between them, this just gives one value, which is a neutral value, and the respondent can indicate a positive or negative reaction to it. This is the example I give you is how people might react to a job that has been described to them. The last type of index I'll talk about is the so-called Gutman, also called scalegram or cumulative index. It's cumulative because the scores, or the answers rather, build on each other. In the ideal, and it is an ideal, if I answer yes to question 3, I must also have answered yes to question 1 and question 2. Hence, getting a score of 3 tells the researcher that I've responded positively to all the previous questions. That doesn't always work out because the respondent's view of the question is sometimes different from the researchers. It's not always the same logic, but that's the idea of it. It is possible to include open-ended questions even for quantitative analysis, but you've got to be very careful on how you use them. An open-ended question, of course, is letting a respondent answer a question in their own words rather than giving them a range of predetermined answers that they have to choose from. You've got to be careful with these if you want to quantify them because you're at risk here. If you ask a vague question, respondents may give you answers that aren't what you were looking for. For example, saying, "What is your opinion of Instagram?" Respondents might answer almost anything. But you could still use an open-ended question where you might say, explain the ways that Instagram has helped or hindered you. And that way you'd get specific kinds of responses to your question that you could then actually code. That said, the answers do need to be content analyzed or coded to become quantitative data. So you're going back to having content analysis that we've talked about previously kind of nested within your survey analysis. How you word your questions is important, but how you order your questions within the survey, what order you put the questions in the survey is also important. Just some obvious examples are so-called contingency questions, where depending on the person's answer to one question, then they will be directed to different questions subsequently. I remember in the heydays of broadcast radio, I used to regularly get a telephone survey from people who were doing radio ratings, and they'd give me a range of radio stations and ask me, which ones do you listen to? Usually none of them were ones I listened to. They were all top 40, and I'd say none of them, and they'd say, okay, we're done, because that was a contingency question. Every question and answer thereafter depended on my having responded that I listened to at least one of the 5 stations they were asking me about. Another issue with question order is what we call respondent fatigue or boredom. The longer the survey, the more likely it is that the respondent's going to get tired of responding and is just going to opt out and not answer any more questions. There's lots of theory on the best way to ask questions to prevent this. There are 2 standards called the funnel theory and the inverse funnel theory. The funnel theory says that you start with general questions, start with more vague questions, and slowly work your way into the more specific or the more sensitive questions, and that this will keep respondents engaged for longer. However, there are also those that argue that the inverse funnel is the correct way to do it. Start with more specific questions because that gets the respondent hooked right away, and then you can broaden out to the more general questions as you go through it. Once you've written all your questions and you've determined what order you're going to put your questions in, you still have one last task, and that is writing instructions for your respondents. Like the questions themselves, the instructions should be as simple as possible, as straightforward as possible. You want to avoid confusing your respondents by giving vague instructions or confusing instructions. That's a challenge sometimes, but that's what you need to do. Okay, we've talked about setting goals, budgeting money and time, making sampling decisions, determining administration mode, and drafting your questionnaire, both writing the questions and deciding on an order for the questions. Your next step is to pilot test and revise your survey. Pilot testing just means that you're going to try the survey out. You need to think about who you're going to try it out on. You might do a subsample of your sample, or you might just have particular respondents that you know about already that you can use, and you'll test it on them. And then you'll ask them about it. Ask them if parts of it are confusing, see how they respond to it, basically. Um, Focus groups are a good tool here. If you run your survey by a group of people and then let them respond to it, you'll get some pretty good feedback sometimes about how the survey should be revised. You also have to think about your training of your interviewers, if you're using interviewers, and debriefing interviewers to make sure that they're consistent in what they do. Pilot testing is a good chance to check that as well. And after pilot testing, you see what your responses look like, not to the survey yourself, but to how well the survey worked, and then you refine everything. You reword, you reorganize, you retrain, rewrite your training instructions as necessary, and so forth. Most surveys are so-called one-shot or cross-sectional design. What this means is they ask people questions at one point in time. They're pretty good at determining opinions or behaviors at that particular point in time, but they don't capture any ideas about changes over time or about cause and effect relationships. To get at those, you need a different kind of survey study, which is called a longitudinal or panel study design. In this case, panel study, so called because you put people on a panel and you ask them questions, and then you go back to them later in time, sometimes much later in time, and ask them the same questions and see if things have changed. This does allow you to capture changes across time, and it also allows you to sort of kind of get at cause and effect. For example, some fairly important media studies surveyed people when they were fairly young about what kinds of programs they watched and whether they exhibited aggressive behavior. And they found there was a lot of correlation with watching violent content and behaving aggressively. But you couldn't say that the content caused the aggressive behavior, because maybe aggressive people like violent TV, right? But if they kept going back, as they did in several cases, and kept talking to the same people across time, they could start to get at this. And what study after study like this found was that watching violent TV when they were young predicted aggressive behavior when they were older, even into like their 30s. In other words, if they watched violent content when they were 12, they would measure positively for aggressive behavior when they were much older. But it didn't work the other way. Aggressive behavior when they were young did not predict taste in television programming when they were older. So you can't actually say in this case that the aggressive content caused the aggressive behavior, but you can honestly say that the aggressive content predicted the aggressive behavior. The thing about longitudinal or panel studies, though, is that they're really expensive. It's really hard to keep people on the panel for a long time. People die, people move away, people lose interest, and so the panel that's actually used to study it tends to shrink across time. Nevertheless, if it can be done properly, it can be a fairly powerful type of survey design. When it comes to actually administering the surveys, the biggest concern of people doing it is always their response rates. A response rate is basically how many people that were initially contacted actually completed the survey. Response rates tend to not be very good in general. I've seen reports of response rates as high as 70%, but most people think 50% is a pretty good response rate, and I've seen response rates as low as 10% that the researchers still published their study with confidence. It's important to distinguish that there are two types of response rates. One is the so-called unit response rate. That's just how many people out of those contacted actually replied to the survey generally. And then there are item response rates. And the item response rate is how many people who completed the survey answered each particular question on it. For example, you might have 100 people respond on a survey, but 40 of them didn't answer question number 6. It probably suggests a flaw in your survey, but that said, it needs to be reported. Some modes of administering allow for follow-ups to try to get the response rate higher. Mail surveys and internet surveys and even social media surveys allow for reminders to be sent. With face-to-face surveys, that's not really practical, nor is it with phone surveys, although I have gotten bugged repeatedly by telephone surveyors sometimes. But the more they call, the more frustrated I get. So I don't think that kind of follow-up really helps. Finally, once you've collected all your data, you want to code it and analyze it. That means basically working out what it means. And finally, the idea is to report it, whether that's in the mass media in the form of a poll, or you're going to publish something in a scholarly journal, depending on the nature of the survey that you did. But it's important to make sure that your report actually reflects the goals that you actually set out with at the beginning, the goals that you set at the very first start of the survey process. So we're almost done with surveys. I just want to close by talking about strengths and weaknesses of quantitative surveys. Strengths are generally that they're standardized. There's not a lot to do with the analysis at the end. If you've written a good survey, the data's there for you and you just have to feed it into whatever statistical equations that you want to use to look at differences or relationships or whatever. Also, surveys are highly generalizable, but that said, if and only if a probability sample was used. Weaknesses to some degree mirror the strengths. One weakness of it being standardized is that it lacks context. We don't understand why several different individuals might respond the same way. It may well be that even though they all gave the same answers or similar answers to things in the survey, they had different reasons why they did it. A survey is not going to capture that because it's just asking very standardized data or very standardized questions, hoping to generalize. Another weakness is a mirror of generalizable. If you read studies closely, a surprising number of surveys actually don't utilize probability samples. That's understandable. Probability samples are hard to create. Nevertheless, it kind of makes their attempts to generalize meaningless. Various modes of administration also introduce sampling bias. Just for example, if you're trying to do a survey on social media, you've automatically excluded people who don't subscribe to the particular social media platform you're on. So if you were doing, for example, a survey about social media use and you post it only on Facebook, you won't find out why people don't use Facebook, because the people who don't use Facebook aren't going to be responding. They can't because you only put it on Facebook. Finally, one particular kind of bias is so-called social desirability bias, which I talk about on the next slide. Social desirability bias is the tendency to present oneself in a favorable way rather than to give accurate answers. What this means is that when you ask people questions about things that are sensitive, even things that aren't sensitive, they might answer in a way that they think portrays them well, rather than giving you the honest answer about what they do. A classic example of this was TV ratings questionnaires back in the old days when they rated TV programs to see how many people were watching them. One way they did it was with a survey asking people what they watched. And eventually they got to a technological assessment of what they watched. They'd actually put a device on people's TV sets that told them what channel people were tuned to at a given time. But for a while, the surveys and the technological approaches overlapped, and they found that people were greatly over-reporting watching things like public broadcasting system or educational programs, documentaries, things like that. They were greatly underreporting watching bad R-rated movies and professional wrestling and MTV music videos and stupid game shows and things because they thought that it made them look stupid to the researchers. That's a quick example of social desirability bias. There are certainly others. And as we close here, I'll just ask you to think about, can you think of any other examples of social desirability bias that might happen? That's all I've got for you. You and I have both survived this first remote narrated PowerPoint lecture. I hope it wasn't too horrible. I hope you actually learned something, and I hope that as I get more practice doing this, these only get better. Thanks for your attention. Talk to you soon. Bye.